Throughout the history of the Pokemon TCG, there have been no shortage of huge and powerful Pokemon, dealing tons of damage and taking knockout after knockout. But oftentimes, some of the most powerful Pokemon are those with a more supportive role. One of the most successful among them is Jirachi. With cards spanning the last 20 years, Jirachi has consistently been one of the best and most versatile support Pokemon in the game's history. So today, let's take a look at the legacy of Jirachi in the Pokemon TCG. Jirachi would see its TCG debut in 2004's Team Aqua vs Team Magma, and is probably one of the worst Jirachi cards that we've seen released. No Pokepower or Pokebody, low damage on both attacks, and only having 50 HP means this card really just doesn't have anything to excel at. Jirachi from Hidden Legends, however, would be the beginning of Jirachi's success. Jirachi's Make-A-Wish attack would allow you to evolve one of your benched Pokemon by searching the deck for its evolution. This was a great attack to help set up your Pokemon, especially in many of the Stage 2 heavy archetypes. While Jirachi wasn't seen in every deck, it was a great option to have in decks whose strategies entirely revolved around multiple evolution Pokemon, especially those that required Stage 2s. With the release of EX Deoxys, we would see the debut of one of the greatest Jirachi cards ever printed. Jirachi's Wishing Star Pokepower allows you to look at the top 5 cards of your deck and put one into your hand when Jirachi is active, though Jirachi then puts itself to sleep. This power is extremely strong. We've seen cards with similar effects printed later on, such as Trainer's Mail or Pokegear, but these always have some kind of limitation, such as only being able to get trainers or supporter cards. While Jirachi's power lets you take any kind of card from the top 5 of your deck. This one difference gives this Pokepower an insane amount of flexibility, as you can grab whatever you need depending on your situation. Still setting up your board? Take a Holland's Mentor. Need to get your evolution Pokemon into play? Get a rare candy or just the evolution itself. Energies, stadiums, tools, whatever you need for your current situation, you can get off of Jirachi. As long as it's in the top 5 cards, of course. The main downside to Jirachi's Wishing Star is that it puts you to sleep. Not only does this make Jirachi a sitting duck in the active spot, it also means you can't use Wishing Star again, since as long as Jirachi has a special condition on it, it can't use this power. Thankfully, there were a multitude of cards to move Jirachi in and out of the active spot, such as Warp Point or Warp Energy, or Heal Energy, which would automatically cleanse Jirachi of any status conditions. Of course, you could just hope to flip heads and wake up naturally, but these cards are very good in their own right, so it really isn't much of a burden to play them in your deck. When it comes to the EX format, it's not uncommon to label Jirachi as one of the strongest cards in the era, with nearly every single deck playing at least one, and the decks that don't play Jirachi usually play a way to counter it. Most common of which are Girafarig, whose rear sensor prevents the use of both active Pokemon's Pokepowers, and Cessation Crystal, which shuts down both active Pokemon's Pokepowers and Pokebodies as long as it's attached to an active Pokemon. All in all, Jirachi is an absolutely vital component to nearly every deck in the EX era, with it being the glue that holds together many archetypes, especially those that rely heavily on Stage 2 Pokemon. But no matter which deck you're playing, Jirachi is a card that demands both consideration as well as respect. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Jirachi EX. While this card is pretty good, it really only sees play in one archetype, that being Delta Gardevoir EX. Gardevoir EX is one of the most powerful decks of its era, largely due to its Imprison Pokepower, which allows you to place an Imprison marker on one of your opponent's Pokemon, which prevents that Pokemon from using its own Pokepowers or Pokebodies. As we saw with Wishing Star, some decks would play cards just to shut off one Pokepower, so being able to shut off multiple, if not all, Pokepowers and Pokebodies on your opponent's side of the board is extremely powerful. However, not only would it take time to get Gardevoir into play, you could only imprison one Pokemon per turn, meaning your opponent would have access to their powers and bodies for the opening few turns, which could be all they need to outpace you and take the game. That's where Jirachi EX comes in. With its shield beam attack, you can deal 30 damage and prevent the use of all of your opponent's Poké Powers for the entirety of their next turn. To make this attack even better, you could use it on the very first turn of the game, as, thanks to Jirachi's Starlight Pokebody, which reduces Jirachi's attack costs by 1 colorless energy if your opponent has any EX or Stage 2 Pokemon in play, all it takes is 1 Psychic Energy to lock your opponent out of their Poké Powers for a turn. This attack, when used in tandem with Gardevoir EX's Imprison, means you can potentially stop your opponent from using any of their powers and bodies for the entire game, which in this format especially is devastating. While this card is overshadowed by its single prize counterpart, Jirachi EX is still a threatening card with tons of potential, especially when played in the proper archetype. Jirachi's success in the EX era is a very tough act to follow, as we can see with the cards released during the Diamond and Pearl era. Jirachi from Legends Awakened is pretty bad. Sure, it can search any card out of your deck for free, but especially in this era, there are tons of better support Pokemon that deserve the deck space more than Jirachi. The same can be said for Jirachi from Rising Rivals, for the most part at least. Its Detour lets you reuse the supporter card you used that turn for free, which is good, but not as good as Smeargle's Portrait or Sableye's Impersonate. Its Pokebody, Final Wish, is interesting, as it lets you search your deck for any card when Jirachi is knocked out, but this doesn't make up for the fact that there are just better Pokemon to play instead of Jirachi. This card is very interesting and full of potential, but at the time it just wasn't as good as the other options. That is when it comes to the more conventional decks. Alright, quick history lesson. During the 2011 season, the sets legal during that time were Majestic Dawn forward. However, with the introduction of Black and White Base and its new Turn 1 rules, it was recognized that Sableye from Stormfront would become a massive problem, with the potential of a guaranteed Turn 1 win. Rather than just ban Sableye, the Pokemon Company International decided to rotate out the remaining Diamond and Pearl sets in the middle of the season. While this was seemingly for the best to preserve the health of the game, this also leaves the Majestic Dawn's Call of Legends format as a relatively unexplored and forgotten format. Within this format, however, is one of the coolest and most intricate decks I've ever seen. The deck in question? Game Over. This deck is a true Exodia-style deck. While other combo decks have some specific condition that must be met by the other player, this deck ensures a win as long as you have all of your correct pieces in play. The deck hinges around Dialga Level X's Time Skip Pokepower, which has your opponent flip 2 coins. If it's 2 heads, your turn ends. But if it's 2 tails, your opponent's next turn ends after they draw for turn, giving you 2 turns in a row. Once you manage to flip double tails on Time Skip, the combo begins. Using Palkia Level X's Lost Cyclone, you reduce your opponent's bench down to 3 Pokemon. You then play the supporter card Seeker, which forces both players to pick up one of their benched Pokemon, reducing them to 2. Then, using Jirachi's Detour, you can use Seeker again, reducing them to 1 benched Pokemon. They draw their card, and it's back to you. Play another copy of Seeker, or use Versus Seeker to reuse the one in your discard pile, reducing your opponent's Pokemon in play to just their active Pokemon. You then retreat Jirachi for free into Drifblim from HeartGold and SoulSilver Undaunted to use its takeaway attack to shuffle both active Pokemon into their respective decks. And just like that, you've reduced your opponent's board to 0, and thus win the game. While this deck can win from any position as long as you have the necessary Pokemon and cards in play, getting to that point can be kind of tricky, but the payoff here is definitely worth the effort. Probably the most crucial card in the deck is Jirachi, as not only is it crucial to the combo in tandem with Seeker, it's also a vital card in getting the deck to its checkmate position. Thanks to its Pokebody, you can search out any specific card you need once it's knocked out. One of the best cards to grab is the supporter card Twins, which lets you search any 2 cards out of your deck if you're behind on prizes. So you can play Twins, get 2 cards, copy it with Jirachi, get another 2 cards, and then if Jirachi's knocked out, you could search for another card, giving you access to nearly any tool that you need at any point in the game. And thanks to Rescue Energy, which returns a KO'd Pokemon with it attached to your hand, you will always have a constant stream of Jirachis to set up the combo. This deck also plays some other rather unique cards, such as Research Record to send unwanted cards to the bottom of the deck, and Bench Shield to protect vital Pokemon from being knocked out on the bench by the likes of Garchomp C. This is by far one of my most favorite decks I've ever seen. While there is no shortage of other combo decks in the Pokemon TCG, this one is a true Exodia-style deck, requiring a huge setup for a huge payoff. And if it wasn't for Jirachi, this deck wouldn't be possible. While this card is buried by the vast array of better Jirachis throughout the years, within this format, and within this deck specifically, it's a crucial and invaluable component that simply can't be replaced. Next up is Jirachi from HeartGold SoulSilver Unleashed. Similarly to the past Jirachis, this card offers some solid support with its Stardust Song Pokepower, which lets you flip 3 coins and for each heads, attach a psychic energy from your discard pile to Jirachi when it's played onto the bench. This power could be used in tandem with Shaman from Unleashed to move the accelerated energies onto another Pokemon, such as Gothitelle or Gengar Prime. You could also use this power alone to get energy onto the board to boost the damage of Magnezone Prime's Lost Burn. However, this card does differ from previous Jirachis in the fact that it can actually take knockouts. Kind of. Jirachi's Time Hollow lets you choose one of your opponent's evolution Pokemon for each energy attached to Jirachi, and devolve them by putting the highest stage evolution into their hand. Obviously, this doesn't do much on its own, but when paired with Pokemon like Yanmega Prime and Kingdra Prime, who both spread damage to multiple Pokemon, you can devolve damaged Pokemon into their lower HP pre-evolutions to score multiple knockouts. Another strong partner to consider is Vileplume from Undaunted, whose Allergy Flower stops both players from playing trainer cards, allowing you to devolve your opponent's Stage 2 Pokemon with Jirachi and trainer lock your opponent to stop them from using Rare Candy to get them back into play, as during this time especially, most Stage 2 decks rely heavily on Rare Candy and usually only play one copy of the Stage 1. While this Jirachi isn't seen in every single deck during this era, it's definitely not one to be overlooked. It's a solid supporting Pokemon with a surprisingly strong attack, which can devastate an unsuspecting player's board. With the release of Black and White's Plasma Blast, Jirachi would get a brand new EX card. This card is somewhat reminiscent of Jirachi from EX Deoxys. Not in what it can do, but more so that the card is just universally good. Its Stellar Guidance ability lets you search your deck for a supporter card and put it into your hand when it's played onto the bench. This effect has been printed on a variety of other cards, both before with Lapras from Legend Maker, and since with Tapu Lele GX, and most recently, Luminion V. With so many printings, it should be obvious that this ability is extremely strong, giving you an out to a supporter as long as you have a way to search out a Pokemon. This also makes it much easier to find specific supporters that you need in the moment, such as Lysander to gust an opponent's Pokemon, Skyla to find a specific trainer, or N to reduce your opponent's hand. One factor that's both a blessing and a curse for Jirachi is its HP. These support Pokemon tend to have a lower HP, making them a sitting duck on your bench to balance out its powerful effect. But Jirachi especially has only 90 HP, making it a huge liability, especially against Pokemon that can deal damage to the bench, like Darkrai EX or Plasma Kyurem. But since Jirachi has only 90 HP, it can be searched out with Level Ball, making it much more consistent to search out Jirachi, and as such, search the supporter that you need. While having Jirachi in play can be a huge liability, the flexibility and consistency that the card brings definitely more than makes up for that. The X and Y era would see quite a few different Jirachi cards released, with most of them being mediocre at best. The one exception, however, is the XY Promo 67 Jirachi, more commonly referred to as Stardust Jirachi. This is because of its attack, Stardust, which for 1 colorless energy deals 10 damage, discards a special energy from your opponent's active Pokemon, and makes Jirachi immune to all damage and effects of attacks for the following turn. This card is extremely useful against decks that heavily rely on special energy, by both getting rid of their limited energies and stalling out an additional turn thanks to the attack's immunity. In this format especially, this attack was super valuable, with many of the high-level decks of the time heavily relying on special energies, more specifically, double colorless energy, with decks like Night March, Vespiquen, Zoroark, Vileplume Toolbox, Mega Audino EX, and Yveltal EX, all either heavily or exclusively utilizing double colorless energy. While there were cards to get special energies back during this time of the game, such as Special Charge or Puzzle of Time, most decks would run either one copy of Special Charge or forego these recovery options entirely, making Stardust's effect even more brutal. One of the best parts of this card is its flexibility, as since Stardust has a colorless attack cost, you could splash it into any deck you'd like regardless of the deck's energy type. While Jirachi was and still is a very effective tech card, it did have some competition when it comes to energy removal, with the likes of Enhanced Hammer and Xerosic generally being favored since they can be used mid-turn and offer more flexibility. Jirachi does still have a place as a one-card tech against special energy-reliant decks, and thanks to its attack making Jirachi immune to damage, it was especially useful in evolution decks, buying time to get your Pokemon into play. The first Jirachi to be released in the Sun and Moon era was actually Shining Jirachi from Shining Legends. While this card is pretty, it's also pretty bad. Honestly, most of the Shining Pokemon from this time were bad, so it checks out. A much more interesting card would be released in Celestial Storm with Jirachi Prism Star. This card is actually somewhat similar to Jirachi from Rising Rivals. Again, not in what it actually does, but rather how it's used, as this card is a crucial piece to an expanded combo deck. This is due to its ability, Wish Upon a Star, which activates if you draw Jirachi as one of your face-down prize cards, and allows you to put it straight onto your bench, and if you do, you get to take another prize card. This ability is very interesting, but also very hard to get any use out of in a normal deck. But when used in a not normal deck, it can form a chain reaction with the potential to take all of your prize cards in a single turn without taking a single knockout. This deck strategy revolves around manipulating your prize cards with the use of the supporter card Peonia, which lets you take 3 of your prize cards and replace them with 3 cards from your hand. This not only gets the cards you need into your prizes, it also lets you know which card is which as you get to choose the position of your new prize cards. Aside from Jirachi, you also want to fill your prize cards with as many copies of Greedy Dice as you can. Greedy Dice is an item card that activates when it's taken as a prize card, and lets you flip a coin, and if heads, you get to take another prize card. With Jirachi and 4 copies of Greedy Dice in your prizes, you have the potential to take all 6 prizes in one turn, as long as you're really good at flipping coins. To get around this luck factor, this deck also plays the supporter card Will, which lets you decide the outcome of the next coin flip that you perform, guaranteeing a heads on at least 1 Greedy Dice. To actually take the prize cards, the deck plays Kartana GX and Missing Clover. Kartana's Blade GX simply lets you take a prize, giving you a guaranteed prize take to start your combo. Missing Clover is a bit trickier. It's an item card that allows you to take 1 prize card, but only if you play all 4 copies of Missing Clover at once. While this may sound like an issue, the deck plays tons of cards to burn through your deck, so you pretty much have access to all of your tools all at once to prepare for your combo, which starts with you playing Will, then using Blade GX to take Jirachi Prism Star, then activate Wish Upon a Star to take another prize, which should be a Greedy Dice. This Greedy Dice is a guaranteed heads because of Will, which means you get to take another prize card. If it's another Greedy Dice, it's up to the coin flip whether you take another one or you stop here. Either way, you're guaranteed 3 prize cards this turn. Your following turn, you pick up Jirachi from the bench using Scoop Up Net or Scoop Up Cyclone to put it back into your prizes along with another Greedy Dice using Peonia. You then pass your turn. Your next and final turn, you play Will, and then activate all 4 copies of Missing Clover to take a prize card, which should be Jirachi. Wish Upon a Star grabs you the dice is a heads because of Will, and with that, you take your 6th and final prize card. This deck has a lot of moving parts to it and is pretty tricky to pilot, but if you could pull it off, you feel like the smartest human being alive. Though the deck does have some weaknesses, most notably the fact that the combo takes a maximum of 3 turns to pull off, giving your opponent time to stop you by knocking out Jirachi before you can pick it up, or playing N and reducing your hand down to just a couple of cards. While this deck is very cool, it's not quite on par with the Game Over deck that we talked about earlier, as with that deck, when the combo begins, your opponent is helpless to stop it. Still, both decks are very intricate and unique, and both 100% require the aid of a Jirachi to pull off the win. Also, real quick, some people did play Jirachi Prism with Zacian V in Standard. You know, you use a Rangaroo to put Jirachi on top of the deck, Mr. Mime to put the top deck into your prize cards, knockout, boom. Sure, this build saw some play, but if I'm being honest here, it seems strictly worse than just using ADP. This next card, however, is a big one, and is probably the best Jirachi card since its EX Deoxys iteration. That, of course, being Jirachi from Team Up. While Jirachi is active, its Stellar Wish ability lets you look at the top 5 cards of your deck and put a trainer card you find there into your hand, but Jirachi is then put to sleep. This ability is nearly identical to Wishing Star. The only difference is that you can only take a trainer card off of Stellar Wish rather than any card you want from Wishing Star. Even still, this card was extremely good, with tons of decks playing this card, such as Pikarom, Reshizard, Dragapult, Zacian, Blacephalon, Malamar Giratina, Mewtwo and Mew, Ultra Necrozma, Spiritomb, Zapdos, just to name a few. Unironically, almost every deck during this time period played Jirachi, and not even just 1 or 2 copies. Most decks played 4 copies of Jirachi just to open it as often as possible to get a good setup. The one downside of this card is the same that plagues Jirachi from EX Deoxys, which is the fact that it puts itself to sleep with its ability, or it would be a problem if it wasn't for Escape Board from Ultra Prism, which gives the Pokemon it's attached to -1 retreat and allows it to retreat even if it's asleep or paralyzed. This card was seemingly made for Jirachi, as it not only gives it free retreat, it also lets you retreat Jirachi after using Stellar Wish, making Jirachi an insanely powerful pivot throughout the game. It also makes it much easier to use multiple Stellar Wish in a single turn, allowing you to retreat Jirachi into another Jirachi to use its ability again and help you dig through your deck to find what you need. This card is easily one of the best Jirachi cards ever printed, probably the best Jirachi card to be printed in the modern era of the Pokemon TCG. Its widespread utility and ease of inclusion made it a mainstay in nearly every single deck of the late Sun and Moon era. Unified Minds would give us one more Jirachi card from the Sun and Moon era, with Jirachi GX. This card has one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to use its Psychic Zone ability to turn off Psychic Weakness of any Pokemon in play. Most notably was Mewtwo and Mew Tag Team GX. As these two were printed in the same set, they were quite literally made for each other. Though it did also see play in Rapid Strike Urshifu decks, to prevent Psychic-type threats from tearing apart your VMAX Pokemon. While this card didn't see play in a large variety of decks, the few decks it was played in, it was extremely valuable. Preventing your opponent from getting easy knockouts on your Pokemon is an invaluable trait to have, especially when the Pokemon in question give up half the game when they're knocked out. The Sword and Shield era would see a variety of Jirachis released throughout its time, with all 3 of them being just okay. Amazing Jirachi has a decent ability with Dreamy Revelation, letting you look at the top 2 cards of your deck and put one in your hand, but unfortunately it was legal at the same time as Stellar Wish Jirachi, which was clearly just better. Jirachi V is interesting, as its Wish Connector ability let you move a basic energy from your knocked out Pokemon V to another one of your Pokemon. While this ability is decent, it wasn't good enough to justify putting a low HP 2-prize Pokemon into play, especially when its ability was exactly the same as the tool card EXP Share. So, Radiant Jirachi is probably the coolest Jirachi to come from the Sword and Shield era. Its Entrusted Wishes ability is a better version of its Rising Rivals counterpart's Final Wish, letting you search your deck for 3 cards when Jirachi is knocked out. This ability is actually pretty good, especially since Radiant Jirachi doesn't mind being in the active spot, as it can take some huge knockouts thanks to its attack, Astral Misfortune, which lets you flip 2 coins, and if both are heads, the opponent's Pokemon is automatically knocked out. While the coin flip does make this attack pretty inconsistent, the fact that you could potentially take an easy 3-prize knockout makes this attack decent at the very least. Especially with the help of Glimwood Tangle, which lets you reflip the coins on your attack, you'd be surprised just how often Jirachi would actually take some knockouts. However, the worst part of this card is the fact that it is a Radiant Pokemon. Since you only get one of any Radiant Pokemon in your deck, you better make sure that the one you choose is worth the space. Basically, this card doesn't see much play because cards like Radiant Greninja and Radiant Charizard are usually just better options. The final card to be released at the time of this recording comes from Paradox Rift, with this Jirachi immediately making an impact on the metagame. Its Stellar Veil ability stops your opponent's basic Pokemon from putting damage counters on your benched Pokemon. While this ability is strong on paper, it's truly only as good as the Pokemon that it stops. But thanks to Lost Box being one of, if not the best deck in the format, and Iron Valiant being a new but powerful archetype, Jirachi gets a lot of value blocking bench damage from the likes of Sableye's Lost Mine and Medicham V's Yoga Loop. This card is still very new, being out for just over a month. And while we don't know what the future has in store for the current metagame, as it stands now, Jirachi is a great tech card against some of the best decks in the current standard format. When it comes to the best Pokemon in the TCG, the usual suspects are those that deal massive damage, both fast and consistently. But in the Pokemon TCG, support Pokemon are just as important to form a successful deck. Throughout the 25 years of the game's history, Jirachi has consistently been one of the best support Pokemon we've ever seen. Whether it's finding cards, finding supporters, discarding energy, turning off weakness, evolving your Pokemon, devolving your opponent's Pokemon, or blocking damage counters, Jirachi always offers some form of useful support. With its wide variety of different and powerful effects, Jirachi is definitely one of the best Pokemon in the entire history of the Pokemon TCG.